It's good to have you with us on this Wednesday, and we are right in the middle of our big family extravaganza as we're looking at Christian worldview versus a secular worldview. And it has been a tremendous time. I want to thank those of you that have prayed. God has done exceeding abundantly above. We've seen so many people come, and then Cola Clash got a great start. Just want to encourage you with what the Lord is doing. It really is a blessing. Right through this crisis, God is answering prayer. So we would ask you to continue to pray. Today I want to encourage you sort of a unique way. Sometimes we don't handle our failures right. And as a result, we can find ourselves miserable when we don't need to be miserable. Inevitably, every one of us are going to have times we make wrong choices, when we allow the flesh to take over. And if we don't settle those issues, we then have consequences in our spirit. We feel cut off from the Lord. There's guilt, and there can be other consequences. And the one that I'd like to talk about today is the matter of blaming. You know, when you get into blaming, or the biblical concept is that root of bitterness, where you are not willing to accept the responsibility for what you've done, but instead it's got to be somebody else's fault. I wouldn't have had that happen had things been better for me. And we find ourselves getting into a negative mentality. You know, it's one thing to be guilty, but I'm telling you, friend, having bitterness, having resentment brings darkness to the soul. In Hebrews chapter 12, we find in verse 15 the strong admonition to be very clearly on guard in our own spirit. It says, looking diligently lest any man fail of the grace of God. Now it's very interesting. You don't get bitter unless you fail to the grace of God. Oftentimes when we read this verse, we miss this part. God's grace is His free gift based upon what Christ did on the cross, of His intervention with His supernatural power to enable us to do what we cannot do. And so when we fail, we have failed of the grace of God. We didn't have to follow through on that temptation. We didn't have to say that. We didn't have to do that. We don't have to feel miserable. We have faith choices we can make that will always then enable God's grace in our life to give us victory. We are overcomers. We're more than conquerors. But what happens is when we fail of the grace of God by letting ourselves sin, and then we get down on ourselves, or we get discouraged and guilty, it's very easy for us to have what happens in the rest of this verse. Lest any man have that root of bitterness springing up, troubling you, and thereby many be defiled. You see, it's in this verse it says, when we fail of the grace of God, the almost knee-jerk reaction is to blame my circumstances or somebody else. You know, men or women are unhappy, they blame it on their spouse. If they'd only do better, if they'd only act better, then they would have a happier life. If they had a better wife or a better husband. Or they'll blame their children, or they'll blame their work situation, or whatever. And sometimes the situations can really be difficult. But no one can take your joy away except you. No one can take the blessing away except you. Yes, there may be grief and pressures because of the circumstances you're in, but your walk with God can be steady, and you don't have to collapse, and you don't have to sin. It's a choice made because we're not trusting God. And so it's very easy for us then to take another step into sin when we do fail of the grace of God, and instead of repenting, we get into bitterness, which is blaming. And it's really tragic. The next verse talks about Esau, who was a bitter man, and it was profane living and immoral living, selfish living that he got into. So it can be a very dangerous, slippery pathway. But mainly I just want to say today, if you're not happy, ask God why, and just get it settled. Confess your sin. He will forgive you. Get the freedom back. Don't blame. Don't get dark. This should be a day of light and blessing. Let God work in your heart today.